equal to the damage that was done. Okay, kind of interesting. Was the war declared by legitimate authority? Yes, the Congress declared war. That's in our Constitution. Were all other means tried to stay out of that war? Interesting. And then was there obviously a chance of success? Because it is the U.S. Army. Okay, so that's a kind of dicey one. Talk about World War II. And this is really, really interesting if you think about it for a moment. Is anybody familiar with the Neutrality Acts? Okay. In the early 30s, mid-30s, there was a thing called the Spanish Civil War, when the communists were killing Catholics and priests and so forth. Well, the Congress of the United States, which represents the people under our Constitution, that derives its authority from God through the people, voted these laws, the Neutrality Acts. And what it was that the United States was not to support foreign wars. In other words, if Russians or French or Germans want to kill each other, that's their business. We're not gonna get into that fight. So, beginning in 1939, the Germans invade Poland, and I'm not going to get into that. That's an obvious off the scale. But the Roosevelt administration felt very strongly that it was important to support the British and the French. Now, I'm not giving you a conclusion, I'm giving you facts. So they began to arm the British and French, sending over munitions and financing them to fight the Germans, okay? Another thing they did was very, very interesting. On the 1st of September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, the United States notified British intelligence where every German ship, merchant ship, was in every United States port, okay? So that they would be waiting for it when they come out. Another thing, and by the way, if you get a chance to read a book called 1941, absolutely excellent book. Particularly here in Southern California, where if you look at our history in aviation, a lot of us are not aware, but we were training British pilots here in the United States before we got into the war. We allowed the British to recruit Americans to fly in the Eagle squadrons, a violation of the Neutrality Acts, right out of the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel down here. MI5 had their headquarters in Rockefeller Center in New York. The guy that wrote Winnie the Pooh was a Royal Air Force officer that was the Royal Air Force attaché to the United States. He was also an MI5 operative. So what he did was he ingratiated himself with the Roosevelt administration, became their friend, went up to Hyde Park, picnicked with them, and was taking notes for British intelligence. They were spying on him. Not that's a bad thing, it's just something for you to be aware of. We began to push out our defense zone into the Atlantic. You all familiar with the shoot outside order? When I was in grammar school at Blessed Sacrament, we had these music sessions. You know, one of the songs they did was the good Reuben James. You remember that? Reuben James. What was Reuben James? Anybody know about that? It was a U.S. destroyer, USS Reuben James. Pete Seeger did the Reuben James. It was a U.S. destroyer that was escorting British munitions off Iceland and was torpedoed by a U-boat. Okay? But we weren't in the war yet. Did we really help things out? Korea. 25 June 1950, the North Korean Army invaded South Korea. After Dean Acheson had said that South Korea was out of our area of interest. This was Secretary of State said this. So anyway, we went into Korea and we defeated the invasion, threw them back, invaded North Korea. Then the Chinese came into the war and we ended up getting forced back below the 38th parallel. Then advancing, but then Truman said, no, stop, and we did so on the DMZ. Was that a justified war? Clearer than some. Obviously, the Congress was never consulted, though. In our constitutional republic, the Congress is supposed to declare war, not the president. Interesting. All other means, well, when you've got an invasion on your hands, it's kind of hard to have other means. Serious potential success, yeah, I think so. And then lastly, did we make the situation worse? So that's the kind of thing you look at for Korea. And now, my personal favorite, Vietnam. Interesting when you read about this stuff. There's a wonderful book, name escapes me now, about Diem, the president, first president. Has anybody read it? He was a Catholic, y'all know that? And he got murdered by his generals. He was the first president of Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, say again? I'm sorry?
Talking about the Vietnamese Catholics.
Yes, exactly so. His brother was a bishop. Anyway, the first line is Vietnam was a war where basically we were defending South Vietnam. Maybe this is the approach. We were defending South Vietnam from the invasion from the north. Here again, you have to go back to just war concept. And I'll leave you to your own decisions. Number one, legitimate authority. Well, we have the same problem with Korea. Again, the Congress is supposed to vote on war under our system. Congress did not vote for war in Vietnam. It gave us the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which kind of gave the president of that day a free hand. And that was interesting. Most of you are probably too young to remember that. When Lyndon Johnson came on television, told us all about how the Turnip Joy and the Maddox, two destroyers, had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. What they didn't tell you was they were providing fire cover for South Vietnamese commandos being inserted into North Vietnam. It's an act of war. Okay, just kind of interesting. Yeah, probable cause of success, yeah, it certainly could have happened. All other means, did we make the situation worse? That'll be debated for another 100 years. But that's something to consider when you look at these concepts. And then the global war on terrorism, where we are today. That's a very good question. Obviously 9/11, we were attacked. Somebody attacked us. The president reacted by sending forces into Afghanistan. You'll remember that probably, even the younger people here will recall. That was legitimate from a congressional perspective, kind of, sort of. How do you declare war against a non-state actor? Say, probable success. We were very successful. Our special operations guys went into Afghanistan, overthrew the Taliban, replaced them with the Northern Alliance, and stayed on. There was a probable success there, had they left it at that. Legitimate authority I touched on. Did we make matters worse? Boy, oh boy, think about that for a minute. That's a tough one. What if we had never gone there? What if after 9/11 we just said, we don't like that, don't do that again? It's a good question. These are very, very complex issues. They're not simple, but at least it starts to give you a little bit of a handrail, a roadmap to think about stuff, as it did for me. My judgment on this, when I volunteered for active service in 2001, was that, hey, if I don't go, somebody's going to go in my place. I'm going to do a good job. As long as it's not unethical, illegal, or immoral, I'm going to the fight, and that's what I did. Other men might have a different decision on that, but you have to have some sort of guidance, some sort of idea, and not just follow the herd or follow the government. Good example of this was the American Civil War, where both sides could claim justification, if you think about it. The North was invading the South from their perspective to free the slaves and save the Union. That sounds defensive. Meanwhile, in the South, they were holding on to their property as they saw it and defending themselves from the invading North. They wanted to secede from the Union, and there was nothing in the Constitution that said they couldn't do that. But on the other hand, if they were going to do that, why weren't they going to pick up a part of the federal debt? They didn't ask about that. And firing on Fort Sumter was federal property, paid for by taxpayers in Maine and North Carolina and all over the country. See how it's not easy. It's not simple stuff. What I've tried to do tonight is just give you a taste of it, not a theological exploration of it, but rather just to give you a sense of my walkthrough on some of this stuff that I looked at 20 plus years ago, and to share with you some ideas and concepts. I would encourage you to look at this, and why is it important to you? Not necessarily that you're going to go to war, but rather you're going to vote for the people that are going to send your sons, and maybe your daughters now, off to war. So you wanna make sure that it makes sense and it's not, I had to laugh. Y'all familiar with John Bolton, who's in the Trump administration? Okay, John Bolton is probably about 78 now, I think. Anyway, Bolton was on, Bolton has never seen a war he didn't like. But anyway, Bolton is up in front of the newsman, and some wag asked him, he says, hey, how come you didn't go to Vietnam? And Bolton didn't bat an eye. He said it would have been a waste of my time. I guess it's honesty, right? Okay, so now making fun of Mr. Bolton. Okay, that concludes my presentation. What are your questions?
Extend your presentation. How close do you think the president's gotten us to World War III?
I'm not gonna comment.
Yeah, when do you not send your sons to war? I mean, if you feel that the war is unjust, you make them felons by not sending them to sign up?
Boy, that's a great question.
And doctors.
That's a great question. I got 4 daughters. Now, the American Legion, and this blows my socks off, the American Legion came out in favor of drafting women.
I remember this.
I don't know if this is a sabotage of selective service or if they're serious, but I can tell you, we would have 4 tickets on Air Canada, the next day. You have to follow the divine law. I mean, that's not the role of women, in my view. And so, if with my daughters looking at the draft, I would say, look, girl, this is the yin and this is the yang. And if you don't want to do that, I'm 100% behind you, and we'll get you out of the country. That's my opinion. Charles?
Yes, you mentioned how St. Jerome talked about wars being in bigger wars, sometimes just wars being in unjust wars, and unjust wars being in just wars.
Mm-hmm.
Both Korea and Vietnam were in a greater Cold War that, although it wasn't directly it wasn't directly declared by Congress, they did in fact agree somewhat to funding and all that. What is your take on the Cold War in terms of just or unjust?
That's a great question. The Cold War, and this is also parallel today with the Chinese. I always wondered, because we were up there in Germany facing the Soviet army, they were going to come over and we're going to kill it. Wait a minute, why are we trading with these people? Why are we sending them wheat? I mean, I didn't get it. I really don't have an answer to your question. I would suggest that this is another one of these convoluted deals where the Cold War was something that a lot of people made money on. It went on and on and on. Now, having said that, there were legitimate fights, legitimate heroism within that potentially unjust war. I mean, if you think about it for a moment, had we stopped sending wheat to the Russians, the Cold War would have probably been over pretty quick. So it was this is just my opinion. So it kind of rolled on for a long time, and a lot of money was been made. And I think part of the thing today is they miss that money, wherever they are. I'm just thinking. John?
Mark had his hand up first.
Oh, okay, Mark.
The term "send your sons off to war" seems irrational to me, because I think the sons probably told their parents, "I'm going to war." No,
Yeah.
in other words, who is sending who and who?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
you're
I'm just
good,
gonna
well
throw that
taken,
out.
good point. I
Yeah.
mean, if you've got an 18-year-old
Yeah.
daughter or son,
Yeah.
well, first of all, you've raised them, so conceptually they have a thought about it themselves. If they choose not to go, for a legitimate reason, I would support that. Now, if they choose to go, I would support that.
Just 2 other real quick things. Women in war. When I was living in San Diego, I happened to know somebody who was in the military, and she basically helped put on a party. And she said at any particular time, and that was since confirmed, that all the women who were on all the ships, 1/3 of the time they're pregnant. 1 out of every 3 women is pregnant, which takes them out of service. Okay, so that's not a good idea, especially, anyway. But the other one was very interesting. You said that they had RAF had come to the United States to hire pilots.
Yeah.
One of the pilots that actually left happened to be the boyfriend of Helen Pinkett. Somebody from Blessed Sacrament might know her name because she was at Blessed Sacrament. It was her boyfriend was the first American to go to the RAF at the beginning of the war and actually get shot down. That makes him famous. So what happens? Here's this woman worked for my family for 8 years. Well, not quite, say 70, I think. And was absolutely a wonderful lady. And her boyfriend was the guy who went over, got shot down. What happens 20, 30, 40 years later? We get a call in the office from somebody who had heard about her boyfriend and wanted to come over and interview her.
Oh, yeah.
So this guy is coming from England to interview Helen. I was there, we went out to lunch together, whatever it was. And that was an interesting story because he heard about the guy and he wanted to hear the girlfriend's point of view. That was one aspect of it. The second aspect is what he did for work. He worked at 10 Downing Street. His job was so secret, his job was to trace all the funny money traveling around the world. And he was really good at it. That's all I could say about that. That was a whole education in itself.
Wow.
Well, you're talking about obscure facts, something you can all take home tonight. Pee Wee Herman's father was a fighter pilot in World War II and flew for the IDF in Israel in the late 40s. You heard it here.
Pee Wee just told
Yes, sir.
It was a wonderful presentation,
Thank you.
and thank you for that. Also, your handout was very interesting, so I thank you for that as well. I know you went through, in a very good way, very comprehensive way for a short talk, the different elements of a just war, and also went through a lot of the historical, which was really great. There's just a little anecdote without making a judgment, again, just stating fact. One thing that's always made me reflect, and doesn't by itself say it was right or wrong, although I'm sure there is a right or wrong if you look at it closely, but when, we all know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when the nuclear bombs were dropped.
I'm sure I'm in my hearing.
We all know about the bombings of, Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh, yeah.
Bombings.
Bombings.
At the end, the war in the Pacific Theater, the war against Japan. But one thing that's always made me reflect, and again, it doesn't give an answer right or wrong by itself, it's a fact.
Yeah.
Kind of like what you're saying about your presentation. Is that when the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, there were approximately 75,000 people who died instantly, not including people, died obviously of radiation later on. But many of those, very interesting thing, I'm not saying it's planned like this, it was just interesting to reflect on. Nagasaki was one of the places where, even when it became outlawed for hundreds of years, Nagasaki was the center of the Catholic community in Japan.
Yeah.
And when the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, a tremendous number of those 70 to 75,000 people were Catholics.
Yeah.
In fact, the most Catholic area in all of Japan was where the Nagasaki bomb was dropped. But it's something to reflect on. It doesn't say right or wrong. I'm just.
No, I mean,
But it's something to reflect on how horrific, because those are just men, women, children.
Yeah.
And of course, we same of other parts of Japan that were mostly Buddhist,
Yeah.
or other Asian religions. But the other thing also is, in the 1994 edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which I know our family uses as a staple, and was this is the one that was put together, by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict the 16th, along with the committee that those two folks appointed to do that important work. But in that 1994 edition, which is one I happen to have, it after going through the different elements of a just war, which you very comprehensively covered, there's something that's just something interesting to reflect on. And I keep thinking it in terms of that historical fact about Nagasaki. And again, anyone's life is just as important, whether Catholic or anyone else, even though we know our Catholic faith is the rock bottom, but the the good Lord's given us, but in the end of the section, in the 1994 edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it says, quote unquote, every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. A danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. And that's just, one of the words.
That would come under proportionality.
And that is under proportionality.
Yeah.
Anyhow, it is food for thought, because I know, for example, and I remember at the time, many Catholics, in the United States especially, and I'm not making any judgment, good people, when Pope Paul VI, in the mid-1960s, I think it was around 1966, I could be wrong, but he issued a document that made a lot of Americans very uncomfortable, and he gave an example, referring to the same things that then under Pope John Paul II in this edition, which was published under Pope John Paul II, makes clear what Pope John Paul II approved. Pope Paul VI said, I think it was 1966, you can check it, in one of his papal letters to the world, that he gave an example, if I remember correctly, that the United States had a right to defend, for example, against Japan, for the war against the United States. But he also said something that angered a lot of Americans, but which may have truth to it to reflect on. He said, quote unquote, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even though there was a just war to fight, he said the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, quote unquote, crimes against humanity. And so I think as Catholics, it's not a liberal or conservative issue. It's not a matter of Democrat versus Republican, which are all these labels are very misleading. For example, Paul VI, defended the right to life. But at the same time, he also said these are issues that, uncomfortable as they might be, they're important.
The idea about bombing and so on, you have what's called collateral damage, okay, and you have intent. So, in my opinion, for what that's worth, what Pope Paul is talking about is the indiscriminate and deliberate terror bombing, such as the RAF did in Germany. Now, you also have bombings that kill people and break things as collateral damage. That's not the intent, but so you have to weigh the difference there. Any other questions?
Yeah, just bringing it up to date for today, right now. Yesterday or today, the Wall Street Journal in the editorial pages had a big article which I'm going to cut out. And I had something that I think Dostoevsky or something. And the editorial is pointing out that so many people around the world do evil things which are unexpected because of the way they were brought up, let's say, okay? Points out that if you approve of somebody else doing something evil, like Hamas attacking the Jews, in the United States, we have a whole bunch of students, maybe 1 million, approving of that attack.
Yeah.
He points out, and it's really well written, a little scary, because he said, if you approve of that, you're more likely to be able to do it if given any reason whatsoever to flip. And we have 1 million people in our right now. This is a scary article. You have to read it, because it's 1 million students out there, and maybe let's say 500,000 students, that can overnight decide to go around killing people if given a good reason.
John, you got a question?
Good point.
Yeah,
It's
you had
history today.
mentioned, these other points are very well taken, that these other gentlemen are making, but you had mentioned that these are complex issues. And you had stated that you were trying not to be judgmental to the best of your ability. The other gentleman here who was making the quote from the statement of Pope Paul VI.
Pope Paul VI, in around
Okay,
1966.
all right, about the
Moving
statement
back.
about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It seems to me, within the last 2 years, Pope Francis, and this is where it gets a bit dicey, it wasn't an encyclical, it wasn't a de fide statement, but he said, when he was in Hiroshima, that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as far as trying to justify them as using a means to an end, were absolutely and irredeemably immoral and wrong. He made that statement. He went further. He said that the mere possession by anybody of a nuclear weapon is a grave offense. It's a grave injustice. It sounds to me like he's describing it as the mere possession by anybody of a nuclear weapon is a grievous sin. Now, I served in the United States Air Force. During your era, I was deployed briefly on a secret mission during Desert Shield Storm to the United Kingdom and then back again. Part of my job, because I was the chief flight surgeon on the base, I was also the head of bioenvironmental engineering and public health. Part of my job was to inspect what were called the WSA, the Weapons Storage Area. We had 24 nuclear weapons on our base.
Wow.
We had a squadron of B-52s, and our mission was very well defined. Probably we had 12 minutes to launch. After that, we would have all been radioactive dust, because there were 2 Russian submarines off the coast, plus they were to come over the pole at us. Okay, so we had three targets: Archangel, Vladivostok, and Port Arthur. Those were Soviet Union nuclear missile submarine bases. The theory was to knock out their weapons before they could knock out more of ours and threaten our cities, so on and so forth. So I actively participated in the care and feeding of nuclear weapons. I knew where they were, I knew what my job was. So to try to bring this forward, what then is the Catholic Church's position in the United States? What does the Conference of Bishops say about men and women who are serving in the armed forces of the United States today, who are on station at Air Force bases or Navy bases, who are part of the nuclear retaliation? Are they in this? I don't mean to be oversimplified, but are they indulging in grievous sin based on what the Pope said, taking into account it wasn't a de fide statement, it wasn't encyclical? What is the position
Well,
of the
okay,
Catholic Church?
let me give a general, and I'm gonna ask Father Fryer to stop me if I become a danger to myself or others. The Pope can speak as a theologian, okay? The ideas that he puts out, or anything in the church, you have to look at its ranking of authority. Obviously, doctrine is doctrine, never changes. So, from my personal perspective, and Father can jump in here if he wishes, but from my personal perspective, you have to look at what the church has always taught. That's your doctrine. It's unchangeable, it hasn't changed. Popes, bishops, priests can speak as theologians, and they can disagree. I mean, I remember I walked out of a church as an officer when a priest was going on and on about the nuclear freeze and how wonderful it was, and how admirable the Red Guards were in Germany, protesting the American nuclear capability of it. That's not the Catholic Church speaking, that's a priest speaking from his own perspective as a theologian, presumably. So the answer to your question is to go back and look at what the church has always taught. If you go back to early times, the 16th century, the Pope himself sent crusades out. They didn't have nuclear weapons in those days, of course, but they were pretty ornery in what they did. I'm not advocating violence or anything like that. I'm just saying you have to take things in the context that it's delivered. Pope Paul VI, when he was talking about Humanae Vitae, that was doctrinal, because that's always been the church's position on it. So that you can ride to the bank. Other things that we hear today from anyone in any capacity, whether it's me or the bishop or a pope, if they're speaking as a theologian, it's not the same thing. So if he doesn't believe in nuclear weapons, that's fine. but until the church decides and roots it in something it's always taught, to my way of thinking, that's off the table.
Yeah.
My opinion. Okay, we're getting kinda late on time, I think.
There's one question over here.
One more question?
Yeah, just, General, based on your experience in the military, today I think we see a lot more fringe activity that might be considered immoral, like financing wars is a fringe thing.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Fringe, you know, it's like, it's associated with the war and unjust wars.
Okay,
And like maybe building of weapons, maybe testing weapons in places.
oh, you know, that's a, that's a whole moral thing, and you're right, I know where you're going with that. A few years ago, and Mark will remember this, we had a really good series of presentations where business people would come up to the podium here, talk about their business, some of those kind of ethical dilemmas you're touching on. If I buy stock in Raytheon, for instance, am I contributing to a war? Well, first of all, I mean, that's kind of beyond even remote cooperation with evil, because Raytheon does a lot more than just bombs and bullets. In fact, I don't even know if they do bombs or bullets, I think it's different. Missiles. So, I mean, you know, that, I have a, here's what I think, you know, again, I'm not a theologian, but if you wanna take the high ground and you wanna socially, and what they call socially responsible investing, I think it is, that's fine, that's admirable, but I really don't, being Father Fryer can add to that, I don't really see that investing in Raytheon or Boeing or something like that is immoral per se. I mean, there's so many other immoral things people are doing today. I don't think holding Boeing stock is really gonna, you know, just my opinion. Thank you.
How about being an Uber driver?
No, that's dangerous.
Charles, you had one more question?
Yeah, I just wanted to put in a thought regarding the atomic weapons and all that. If you use the reverse logic, let's say we assume that holding atomic weapons and everything like that is immoral, and let's say we get rid of that, where does that put us in terms of our own security, of our own people?
Get nuked.
You know what I mean? There's that question that you have to question morality. If you take away all the nuclear weapons, how does that protect us from other people who do have nuclear weapons?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Very simple, you have the right and the responsibility to be strong enough to defend or deter somebody from being aggressive.
In fact, that's what the Council of Bishops say, the Catholic Council of Bishops, we have a duty to protect our country and protect the people inside of it.
Sure.
Mark Padilla, did you have a Newman reading by chance?
I do not, sir.
Okay, why don't you come up over to the side and close it out? Motion is made to close the meeting. Anyone say
Second.
aye?
I second.
All right. Okay, guys, we don't have to pass out, so we're gonna do the salve together, okay?